name's JC McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I think the last time we met was in November. So heading into the winter, now we're coming out of the winter, so I'm very happy about spring arriving. So we have a pretty full agenda. Before I get into that, some of you have heard that I'm retiring at the end of this month, which is actually at the end of this week. So I'm leaving the state after 34 years, and I just wanted to say what a privilege it's been to be part of this process, part of this project, and we have a great team, but really we've come this far because of all the good work from folks like you participating in the advisory committee and all of the community members that we've met with. You know, I said from the very beginning that we can't have success without really good public participation, right? In the old days, we kind of had success on occasion, irrespective of public participation, but we have a different mindset these days, and I know the DOT folks, especially the younger guys, really have a different mindset, and I think this is a good example of what can happen when we work together and really kind of work collectively towards a goal. So thank you for your commitment to the project and to the city. So the team will, thank you. And the team will, yeah.
Where are you going?
Well, I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I told my wife there are no highway consultants in New Jersey, so I won't be moving. I won't be moving there. Greg DeRoche. Oh, Greg, introduce yourself. Greg is my manager.
Hi, how are you? Greg DeRoche. I'm the division chief in the highway group. We already had just.
Well, we have Andy Fessenmeyer, who I think you started to see in the past few meetings. Andy's been around a long time, worked on a lot of large projects, so he's the project manager, and he and Kevin Burnham, the project engineer, will step in. It'll be seamless. We'll be good, right?
We're going to work really hard to get a replacement for Rich, so we'll get you somebody that you'll work well with.
Thank you. All right, thank you. So with that, we'll get started. We have, like I said, a full agenda. And Casey, we're not. There we go. Okay. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce some new members. Tony Chirolis from Center of Latino Progress. Tony, put your placard out and make it official.
Hi, getting there.
And Tony's been very active in the community. You probably know him already and comes to a lot of our public forums. John Walsh. Is John here?
Yes.
Not John, next to Mike.
So just real quick, 19 years of that in the Hartford office and a couple years down in Middletown. Slowly working with Mike to mentor and take over some of the stuff he's doing now.
Great, thank you for being here. Julio Concepcion, is Julio here?
He's not here.
He's not here, okay. He'll be representing Metro Hartford Alliance. We're replacing Oz Griebel. Mike Kolanowski from Amtrak. I don't know if he's here personally, or we don't have anybody on the phone. Okay. Mike will be replacing Earl Watson from Amtrak. And Chris Hansen, is Chris Hansen here from Federal Highway? All right, but Dave Nardone and Ted, are you migrating to Chris, or he'll be in addition? So Chris Hansen works with Federal Highway on the environmental planning aspects, and he's been a great asset to our progress. So with that, we'll get into the agenda. Again, it's pretty full. 25 minutes we'll spend a fairly lengthy amount of time on the multimodal planning effort, local road network, CT Fast Track. Christine will give us an update on the environmental documentation. But what are today's goals and objectives? We do want to make our recommendation and hope have your consensus on what we believe the multimodal station should look like. It's citing not a lot of details, but generally where it should be located on the site. You know, we've been at it for about a year now. We first introduced it last April. We've had 2 public forums, 2 public workshops, 3 technical transit committee meetings. So we've been at this a long time, and the good news is that it's been a very strong collaboration with the city of Hartford and their consultant team. And that process will be led, that presentation will be led by Casey, but the consultant planners will kind of answer your questions and fill Casey's presentation in a panel kind of format. Casey's then going to talk a little bit about the ongoing local road network configurations that we continue to work on, but we're making good progress. Also, CT Fast Track. I know a lot of you have asked what's going on with CT Fast Track, how will that blend into these concepts? We've been working really hard behind the scenes. It's been a challenge because we are changing the nature of the corridor by relocating Amtrak and lowering the highway down. But Casey will update us with the current thinking on how CT Fast Track can be integrated into the plan. And then again, Christine will update us on the environmental impact statement. So I think that's it for my introduction, and now I'm going to turn it over to Casey.
Thanks, Rich. I apologize in advance. You're going to hear me talk a lot here. So we're going to go through a little exercise. I'm going to bring up a couple other members of the consultant team. We're going to go through 5 of the representative station concepts, and I'm going to give you a little introduction just as we get there. So in November 16th was the last gathering for this group. We did go through 5 of the concepts in kind of a similar format to what we're doing today. We looked at the sites and how they work and how the different modes at the station, the rail, the bus, the transit access to the local bus routes, how they all interact along with bicyclist pedestrian access. We also really started to delve into the evaluation criteria, and that is kind of where we've spent a lot of our time over the last few months looking at these concepts and evaluating them. So I'm going to invite the panel to come up now. So David, Bill, Gina as well. So our panel is David Spillane coming up here from Diddy Clancy. He's on the DOT team, our lead urban designer. Bill Kenworthy behind him from HOK is urban designer for the city of Hartford. And then Gina from Trans Systems is the lead transportation planner on the station effort. So David, do we have those mics? David, I'm going to let you explain some of the urban design considerations we've used to evaluate these stations.
So as we're thinking about the station, there were really 4 urban design considerations that we had. The first one really spoke to visibility, that the station was located in a place that was prominent, was visible from major public streets, that really emphasized its importance and significance as an important transportation facility, and had a good access for the public. The second was the relationship between the station and transit-oriented development, which will be an important part of sort of rebuilding the urban fabric in the project area that connects the 2 sides of the highway. The third part really related to open space, and I think this is an important ingredient of what happens in this area, which we've talked relatively little about. It's one of the more likely uses for the land over the highway cap, which has significant constraints or cost implications in terms of building buildings on that cap. So that's a likely use of the capped area. And I think when we think about open space, I think we shouldn't think about it as being just like a passive park like Bushnell Park, but something that could be far more actively programmed with a variety of uses, maybe active recreation, ball courts, other kinds of things. So it could be a very different kind of open space that also draws people to this area and creates activity around the station. And last, and certainly not least, as we think about this, we need strong neighborhood connectivity to neighborhoods, including the downtown neighborhood and every side of the corridor, and that means strong pedestrian connections to and from the station and to and around the corridor.
Thank you, David. So we're also looking at those primary elements of our purpose and need, the traffic operations, safety certainly, and mobility. And that applies not just to the station itself, how it functions, how it serves the different uses, but also how it then interacts with the local street network, ensuring the access to parking or for buses at the appropriate locations, and also making sure that bicyclist pedestrian access from some of these major corridors, the broad streets, the asylums, is inviting and welcoming. Gina is going to touch on some of the transit aspects that we've used to rate these station concepts.
Right, Kate. Hello, there, okay, right. So what we've heard really throughout the whole process and what we believe are best practices is the multimodal functionality of the station area. So the connectivity between bus and rail and how that interfaces with the pedestrians and the bikes. So that's really a key evaluation criteria for us as we go through the concepts. That as well as how the transit operations work. So we want to make sure that the station concept has good access for the local buses, the intercity buses, and CT Fast Track with regard to the surrounding streets and respecting the traffic situation in the roadway infrastructure.
Thank you, Gina. Then sort of the last grouping is sort of a catch-all we called engineering, and that basically is looking at how the station will function when it first opens. So right, the first thing we're going to need to do is relocate the railroad, construct the station, get it open and operating, really while the existing highway and road network is still in place. And I'm going to have some images that will help you guys understand that, because it's kind of a complex situation. We also look at costs. First, we kind of had a qualitative approach. We've recently done a few cost estimates on these, and we're kind of filling in the gaps with some quantitative information. And then we also look at the rail operations and the maintenance, and how does the station function within that context. So in terms of access down to the platforms, as well as how much of the rail corridor would be tapped, thereby requiring ventilation, because this is still a diesel corridor. So I'm also going to allow John, I think behind Gina, to talk a little bit about the city's Capital Gateway concept plan and some of their goals.
So we're working very closely to make sure that the investments in transportation are leveraged and really benefit the city. So the principles that we're looking at as we work with this team on the city's perspective is really how to improve connectivity. Once the highway improvements are in place, once the new station is located, how do you actually get to destinations in the neighborhood? What streets can be connected, what roadways can go through, and really how people can walk around once they're at the station. We're looking at how you can not just walk, but you can also bike and really use that to get around. We're looking at how you create a district. It's great to have the station and the infrastructure improvements, but how does that really start to grow into a district that connects Asylum Hill and the businesses up there to the downtown core? Also, so how do we leverage the open space that David talked about to really spur economic growth and development? You know, it's great to have office buildings, residents, and apartments, but you really need a place for those people to get out and really interact with the city. And finally, what this adds up to is helping set the stage for economic development. You know, as I said, it's really taking the transportation investments and leveraging them for the city's benefit and economic development.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm just going to take a moment and orient folks to this map here, and I'm going to end up using some version of this as we advance through the different station concepts. So this is existing conditions. So again, today the railroad comes underneath these I-84 ramps along Bushnell Park. Here's Union Station, just off Asylum, and then the rail continues to the north under I-84. Here are those two sections of I-84 where westbound goes under Asylum and eastbound goes over Asylum, and then the same thing at Broad Street. And here's Farmington coming into Asylum and Broad Street at the Trident intersection. So I'm going to flip it forward to show you the lowered highway. So the first thing you probably notice is both the highway and the rail shifting dramatically. So the rail from Union Station, Bushnell Park, over to the west side of the highway, but also the highway itself, the lowered highway, being reconstructed a little bit, about 200 feet to the west of the existing alignment. So we've also included on this map that Garden Street extension we talked a lot about the last meeting. So Garden Street today comes down here, intersects Asylum at an angle. We're proposing to realign it, cross over the railroad and lowered highway, and intersect Spruce Street. We're also illustrating that Farmington extension concept we've discussed previously. I will get into a little bit more detail on that in kind of the next module, but it is something that we've now adopted as a team. The city's a strong proponent of it, and we're gonna illustrate it in this manner on these drawings that we're showing for the multimodal station. You can also see this shaded area here, and that's intended to represent this tap we proposed between Broad Street and Asylum. And that would cover both the highway as well as the railroad. So again, when we talk about our station study area, we're really looking at either north of Asylum or south of Asylum, and that's really how we've grouped these station concepts. We also need to factor in transit and how the transit routes pass through this area. The first thing I'm going to illustrate is CT Fast Track, and again, we're going to talk about that later, but generally we're envisioning it entering the corridor similar to how it does today, where it would kind of come in from the west and then follow up that Bushnell Park West to Asylum Street. There's also a very high ridership on local bus routes from west to east, in particular on Farmington Avenue, but also up Asylum, and then there are other routes that go up to the northwest as well as north-south along Broad Street. So we're going to go through 5 representative concepts, 2 south and 3 on the north, and we're going to I'm going to use the panel to touch on those different considerations we explained a couple slides ago. So our first southern concept, Concept J, is actually one that was recommended by a PAC member and Bill McCauley as well, who's in attendance today. So it would feature a rail station at the corner of Broad, that Farmington extension and Asylum, a bus facility located essentially on the highway cap, parallel with Farmington extension, structured parking adjacent to Broad Street between Broad and that Farmington extension on a cap over the highway. And we're illustrating a kiss and ride or a drop-off location, which would be accessed off of either Farmington Extension or potentially Broad Street. So I'm going to bring in an artistic rendering here and ask David Spillane to talk a little bit about how he sees this fitting into the urban context.
Casey calls this the artistic rendering. What I call Casey's drawing is the X-ray, because it's just showing the infrastructure. And I think the success of this ultimately is tied to creating a real place over the highway that connects the two sides, and that's sort of made up of the critical pieces of a transit infrastructure, the station, the bus station, a parking, kiss and ride, and all those other pieces, plus open space, plus urban fabric, buildings with people and activities. So the artistic rendering sort of includes those pieces in as well. So just a couple of observations on this, and I'm going to comment on some of this, and I think Bill's going to comment on pieces of this as well. So what you see here is as Casey said, the rail station anchors the corner of Asylum and the Farmington extension, and that creates a pretty strong corner. I think it meets the criteria we talked about in terms of good visibility at a very important city intersection. In terms of open space, in this one, we're showing open space, here, adjacent to the building. Probably not the best location for it, as it's not well connected to many of the things around it. So that might not get quite the level of use or activity we might, hope for. Asylum Avenue in this one, I think works really nicely. What we've got on the north side are new buildings. The station becomes an important part of the street, and all of the kiss and ride and other access functions are really pulled off onto some of the other streets. So Asylum works pretty well. Concerns from me on this one, from an urban design perspective, would be that Farmington Avenue extension, because what we get on that street is a street that at the corner with Broad has the rail station, but then you've got the bus station behind that. We've got parking on the other side of the street. So what we've got on the Farmington extension, where I think the vision and ambition for that is that it's a gracious street that extends the Farmington corridor into the heart of downtown. I think a lot of the things in this option that are on that really are sort of support infrastructure. If you can imagine Spruce today, a lot of those activities in this version are coming onto Farmington. In a similar way, I think that Broad, which is such an important connection, across the corridor, is a street that's really becomes defined by largely a parking structure, kiss and ride, and other things. So I think ultimately what we get here is not a great street on Broad, not a great street on Farmington. Asylum works really well.
Thanks, David. Gina, can you tell us a little bit how you see this working from a transit perspective?
From a transit perspective, actually, it would work well because in some parts, because the rail and bus are in proximity to each other. You would just be crossing at grade to get from the one facility to the other. So the bus passengers would also be using the rail station for waiting area, for vendor space, and so on, as well as crossing to the parking lot. That also would be done at grade. To get on the north side of Asylum, which you may want to do to either catch a local bus on the north side of the street, we could possibly build a concourse level, so level below the at grade to make some connections. From a passenger loading perspective, the two south options, the next one we'll discuss in a minute, though, have some drawbacks because the station is on the south end of the platform, meaning that the passengers would be loading on one end of the platform as they leave the rail station, rather than distributing among the platform, which is more ideal, to have the rail station more in the middle of the platform.
Thank you, Gina. And Bill, from your perspective, what are you seeing with Concept J?
Sure. So from an economic development standpoint, we begin looking at what some of the key sites on Spruce and Asylum, down lower on the south side of Asylum and Bushnell Park West. An opportunity here, which really isn't an opportunity in this plan because of the location of the bus infrastructure, and then one down here on Road B. So those are just some things to consider with this plan. The great addresses, it could be on Spruce and Bushnell Park West, facing the park in terms of the considerations and how we get the active frontages on those streets as well as the open spaces that surround it. And we'll be touching on those criteria as we walk through each one of these versions.
Thanks, Bill. And so the last bullet I'm just going to touch on, one of the concerns we see with locating these facilities south of Asylum is that the access both for the parking, for the buses, is off of one of these major streets. It would have to be off of either Broad, Farmington, or even Asylum. And so that's something we'd like to avoid. There are also some staging or phasing concerns, and I'm going to bring up a map to try and illustrate that a little bit. So what you're looking at here is really what we're calling a phase one. So we've relocated the railroad, but the existing highway network and the ramps are really still in the same locations. And ultimately, that Farmington extension can't be built to essentially the very end of the project after we've already lowered the highway. So we'd be in a condition where we would need to create essentially a temporary station, and it'd be really difficult to provide any parking for it. And I know that's probably an unpopular take, but we do need to provide some. And so the only opportunity we really see for that is to use this lot that's currently owned by the Hartford that we would need to acquire to construct the railroad, and use that to provide parking temporarily. And of course, that temporary is really 4 to 6 years. So this is really kind of a downside to this southern option, how it would function in this first interim phase. And the same thing would really apply to our second southern concept, Concept K. So in this one, the rail station stays right in that same location between Farmington Extension, Asylum, and Broad. The bus facility and a parking structure would be combined in one building located along Broad. Most of it would be on a cap over the highway. We've got a couple different ideas for where a kiss and ride or a drop-off could go. One is as illustrated here. On the next rendering, you'll see it could also be here. So I'm going to start with Bill on this one. Bill, do you want to talk about some of the urban design and development aspects?
Sure. So on this one, the rail station is obviously still to the south. The kiss and ride is here on Farmington. In this one, we've relocated the bus parking along Broad Street, which allows the center of this block to be opened up for open space with development surrounding it, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Some of the considerations here are obviously the relationship of bus parking against Broad Street and Frogs Hollow, and as a kind of a drawback to this particular scheme. But what this really does is begin to open up the center of the plan and allow more of the amenity spaces associated with the buildings to become part of the experience with the open space as well.
Thanks, Bill. Gina.
Yeah, for this concept, the rail and the bus are a little bit too far apart to allow the rail station to function as the bus station also. So in this case, you almost would need to build a separate bus waiting area just north of the bus or even south of the bus parking area. So from that perspective, it's not as ideal as the previous concept. And then Broad Street, there may be some traffic issues related to the buses coming in, going out of that street also.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of access management or kind of the functionality of Broad Street, again, that's just where some of the concerns with this one lay. So now I'm going to move to a northern concept, concept E1. We're going to show basically 3 different versions of concept E, and the differences are really in where we locate the bus and the parking facilities. So now the rail station on the north side of Asylum, constructed over the tracks between Asylum and Garden, and we envision it would have a facade on both streets, and in particular we would pay attention to that Asylum facade in terms of pedestrian access. The bus and parking facility would be located on a cap north of Garden Street. So this is a change from other concepts and other previously illustrated cap options, where we're now having a cap that extends well to the north of Garden Street. We've illustrated a kiss and ride here on this drawing. It could also be a little bit more linear along Garden Street, but generally speaking, we're thinking it would be along accessed from Garden Street. So I'm going to start with David on this one, if you want to touch on some of the urban design aspects here.
So, you know, this one, we have the rail station, you know, here on Asylum, coming out to the edge of the street, and I think that, you know, we've studied views up and down Asylum, and if you go right back up, you know, Asylum, a building that came out to the edge of the street, if the building beside it was slightly set back, really could terminate a long vista along Asylum, just as the Congregational Church does at the other end, right up here. So in terms of visibility, I think we've got some strong visibility here. In this case, we've got Asylum and Farmington are really terminating in an open space, you know, here, which, you know, as I said, might not be an open space like Bushnell Park. It could be something that accommodated active recreation. It could even potentially, you know, have some buildings that were lower buildings, pavilions that activated the park. But this, in effect, becomes the station square as a space that's shared between commuters, surrounding neighborhoods, and the corporate communities that are here, and becomes a gateway from the downtown to the neighborhoods and vice versa. Looking at the streets, I think one of the things we get is a nice transition along Cogswell to Broad, which is really a connection along the edge of a park. Farmington, again, connects through you know, a park space as a gracious street, as is Asylum. In this case, most of the functions for the bus and rail station drop-off pickup are on Garden, but just because of the configuration of the street, we're able to include them in a more compact way than we were on this much longer Farmington connection here. So in this case, I think there's a pretty good relationship between development and open space and the train station in ways that each of them reinforces the other.
Thanks, David. Gina, do you want to touch on the transit?
From my perspective, E1 really works well from a multimodal connectivity practice. There's rail and bus are relatively in close proximity. You could either cross at grade on Garden, or you could possibly build a concourse level. Again, the platform level is lower level. You could have a concourse in between the at grade and on the platform level to have some connections, you know, on that concourse level between the bus and the parking. The drawback here, though, is it does require a cap. The cap is very costly, and we also don't have a really good read on whether or not there are security or safety concerns building over a highway. So those are considerations that we are still thinking about, but the cost implications render this one maybe not as feasible as we would like.
Thanks, Gina. In terms of the phasing, we actually see the northern functioning a little bit better during that phase 1, where the rail station would kind of fit in nicely with where we are able to provide that parking access to be further up off Cogswell Street, kind of take some of the burden off the Trident area. So we do see that working better. And just to confirm for everybody, the bus activity would likely remain at Union Station until the bus facility would be constructed, which for kind of each of these concepts ends up being kind of late in the construction process. So Gina had touched on the capping north of Garden and the potential cost implications. So the second version of Concept E2, we looked at shifting the bus and parking facility into this piece of land bounded by Garden and Spruce Streets and the lowered highway I-84. And then same kind of idea with the kiss and ride. So Gina, what do you, how do you think that works in terms of transit?
Well, in this
functionality?
concept, the bus is really acting similar to what it would be doing now in terms of being very proximate to Union Station. However, from a best practices or what we've heard from the public, we really feel that the bus and the rail should be pulled as close together as possible. So for this concept, it would not really support that multimodal functionality.
Thanks. Bill, do you want to?
Sure. So the big difference for the economic development in the streetscape is you're obviously taking what was a developable frontage across from what the repurposed Union Station could be and relocating the bus station to that area. Now, that doesn't mean there couldn't be active things happening near the ground floor to keep that experience of a higher quality, but it's just something to consider in terms of what's fronting on what the repurposed Union Station might be going forward in the future.
Thanks, Bill. So ultimately, what we then tried to do is take those two concept E's and try and balance the cost implications, the need for capping, and also try and create a little bit better multimodal functionality. And so the way we did that was we took our E2, which of course has the bus facility located in this parcel next to Spruce and Garden, but we've now shifted the bus closer to the rail station by bringing it underneath Garden Street. So this is below Garden Street, essentially constructed where that parking lot is today for Union Station. We would excavate a little bit down to allow Garden Street to come over. And again, the same general concept for the kiss and ride. Gina, do you want to talk a little bit about how that affects the
this actually
multimodal?
is a pretty good compromise, especially if there is a cap, which will be shown in the next slide between Asylum and Garden, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But this at least brings the bus and the rail closer together. It lowers the bus facility to below grade, but yet has access off of Spruce Street because of the hills and the grade. So the buses can operate pretty efficiently coming in and out of the bus facility, as well as the parking vehicles for the parking lot. It does provide a connectivity between the rail and bus that we could actually have as climate controlled. You see that blue, that would be representing some type of a pedestrian walkway between the bus and the rail. And you could bring actually passengers from the rail to the bus facility through an underground tunnel possibly, or some type of a concourse also. So there would be some connectivity.
Thanks, Gina. David, do you want to touch on some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one is really very similar to the one that Bill previously described. I think the real difference is only the ability to get passengers between the bus and rail functions, internally without going out on the streets. That's the primary difference. From an urban design perspective, I think they are essentially the same.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to advance one more, and Gina had referenced this idea of potentially capping this area between Garden and Asylum, and it is something the city's expressed a real interest in. So I'll let Bill give his thoughts here on this image.
Sure, and the concern and consideration is the relationship of this open space to the new train station, as well as the development that sits up across from it, and the experience walking down Garden Street, and making sure that whatever happens in here doesn't feel like it's a hole in the ground with a lot of noise coming out of it. So the goal here would be not necessarily in an intensively planted way, but maybe there's a way to get a structure that can still be active. I'm still concerned about the size, and I think David shares my concern about the size of this space. This is about an acre worth of space over the highway, 200 by 200. But to create an opportunity to be a new open space heart in what could be a new commercial district related to the rail station, and to provide mitigation against what otherwise would be an opening down into the highway for the purposes of development happening north of Asylum.
Thanks, Bill. So, ultimately, I think the conclusion here is based on a lot of those different factors we explained that generally favored the northern sites. We've then worked to create this concept D3 that we feel best represents a compromise in terms of the potential construction costs versus the multimodal functionality, and we're kind of here today to recommend this concept. So again, to wrap that all up, we do feel that E3 best satisfies the criteria, has all those advantages that are shared with the northern concepts, then has that balance. And We're hoping that the next steps from here would be to advance the design of that station to what we call about a 15% architectural level, which we'd wrap up right about when the EIS process concludes. So we did want to pause for Q&A here. If one of you guys could be a runner for the microphone if we need one. Tony.
I'm a little nervous by all these pretty green open spaces without any apparent function. Are they really going to develop? Are they going to be maintained? Who's going to take care of them? Do we need them when you consider the park is right there? I mean, I think just open space for the sake of open space is a bad idea. And unless you can be more clear about the function of the open space, I'm not sure I would want to see it there.
Sure, absolutely.
I guess Tony's maybe concerned about the open green space. I don't see where there's any of it in Asylum Hill, and I really don't understand the Garden Street extension. It seems to me that it's more of a utility street for all of the transportation as opposed to a city street like Myrtle and Fraser are now. It's really, it seems like you need that street to make all your plans work for this. And somebody at one point said that's also the access road to get on the highway going one of the other directions. So just help me a little bit more with what happens on Garden Street.
Sure, yeah. So there would be no access to or from the highway from Garden Street. While it would likely have the access to the drop-off area, all of the bus traffic would be routed into the bus facility at Church and Spruce. So there really wouldn't be any consolidation of bus traffic along Garden Street. And our intent with the design of the drop-off area is to provide sufficient capacity for it off of Garden Street to prevent Garden Street from backing up in the same way Spruce Street does today. So again, Gina and her team went out, conducted some counts during the highest periods, and we've come up with about, 30 spaces, which should provide plenty of capacity. And we also could provide additional drop-off capacity tied into the bus facility.
So you see that flowing as just like a little regular street.
Yeah, I'm looking
I think
at-
30
looking
is
at
low,
Nick,
by
too.
the way, because I've counted more than 30 cars on the street during rush hour. I mean, we were there during the peak hour and counted.
I think the hope of Garden Street is that it's an important pedestrian connection from Asylum Hill down through the new district we're creating to the repurposed Union Station. And the idea is that it's a pedestrian bike street that happens to have access vehicularly into the station, and that this is going to look and feel like a city street. There are some frontages that are a little tougher with the bus station. And the idea would be we would try to activate those frontages to the degree we can at the ground floors, which is the most critical part, to make sure that you have as seamless as an experience as you can coming down through here, is the goal. And to Tony's point about open space, you know, I'm the biggest advocate in the room for making sure we manage and control and have properly scaled open space. So there's certainly some concerns about, you know, being able to fit a Bryant Park-sized facility within this green space. And I don't know that it has to be as green as we're showing either. I think it's about really creating, you know, a great program that's seasonal, that allows it to be active a lot of the year. I don't think we want to create another Bushnell Park because you've got a great Metropolitan Park right on the other side of this development. This open space wants to be a different kind of setting, more courtyard-like, maybe harder paved than green. Not that you can't have trees, but the idea is that it's got more different types of uses that are happening, helping it be an active space year-round, 12 months of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. And I think in terms of open space, where we would be is we would be at the beginning of the conversation about how to really make that something that was, you know, valuable. I think that Providence went through a similar process with, you know, similar circumstances when they created Water Park Place, you know, as part of a major new development as they moved rivers and highways. And that's, you know, adjacent to large areas of open space and parkland around the state capitol building as well. So I think it will take a lot of work going forward to fully define that. I think there are possibly interesting connections from the YMCA there in terms of programs. I think it's a place that we could think about playgrounds, bowl courts, all kinds of other things that really made this a valuable community space, and a space that was used very differently from Bushnell Park, but it will require a significant more attention going forward. But I think there are really very great opportunities there.
And there's one more important point, I think, about the size of that open space. A lot of it's dictated by the highway infrastructure or the train infrastructure that sits underneath. It's very difficult to build buildings on top of. So about designing this, for sure, we need to think about what the right things to do here to make that space something that's more manageable in terms of size, scale, and character. But it's better than having a hole down into the highway, which would be the alternative, because otherwise you're going to build a bunch of, like heaven over 84 is basically a building site that never happened, which would be the end result otherwise. So we need to make sure we get that right and we program it correctly for the long term.
Aaron had his hand up first. I think one of you men's running out.
Well, Bill just took my first thought. I would definitely agree. I think it's been generally accepted in the room here that private development is not going to occur over the highway because of the additional cost of the increase in size and the cap itself. So I strongly agree that it would be much better to have green space capped on top of the highway and hide the impact through this stretch than anything else. Most in this room know that's what I've been pushing for from day one on this project. So that being said, I am encouraged, as I've said many times, to see the cap along this section and to see the green space there. Along those lines, and knowing that we're not going to get private development on top of the structure, I would strongly encourage the reconsideration of concept E1. One of the main goals of this project has been explained to me to reduce traffic congestion through this area. One of the most cost-effective ways to reduce traffic vehicle congestion on highways is to get people in public transportation. And it was pointed out the best way to get people using public transportation is to make it easy and convenient. To separate the bus and the rail, it doesn't, on this drawing, it doesn't seem like a long distance, but I know many that will use that as an excuse, as where E1 really pulls together the bus and the rail use. Many in my neighborhood will use the bus as the beginning and end of their commute. They'll take the bus to the train station and take the train to work, and then do the opposite. So I would encourage reconsidering the concept of E1 and recognizing that there are other cost benefits by putting those structures together. I also am discouraged about E3 by the fact that we're eating up yet another prime piece of real estate in the heart of downtown with the use of a parking garage, where parking garage over the highway is a great use of that space that would otherwise be wasted.
Thanks, Aaron. I just wanted to confirm one thing on the bus access to the station. So while we label this as the bus facility, that's really primarily an inner city bus facility, your Greyhounds, your Peter Pans. I'll talk a little bit more in the CT Fast Track part of the presentation, but we definitely envision that the local bus routes that today take Farmington and Asylum, and potentially CT Fast Track routes as well, would still have stops kind of right in the vicinity of the train station. So if you were taking a local bus to the train station, it wouldn't necessarily take you to this bus facility.
I kind of agree with Aaron as far as E1 is concerned. And I like the idea of the green space. I think Bill McCarsky, from even before this project ever began, has talked about the view from the little girl and the hands across to the state capitol. And this green space makes sure that nothing obstructive is going to be there. If you do E3, could you talk more about the tunnel? Because I would be fearsome that it would turn out to be a narrow, scary, unattractive, hard to keep clean space. What do you think you might do to make it beautiful, appealing, and comfortable to walk through?
So I think you're referring to, Gina, you're talking about this potential passageway underneath Garden Street here?
Correct, yeah.
No, between the two,
Well, the
rail and the bus.
Oh,
that would not be a tunnel.
Yeah, that would not be a tunnel, what we're showing there. I had mentioned that there could be a concourse connection, tunnel type connection also below the at-grade. This, actually, what we're showing there is an at-grade crossing, just a climate controlled. So it could be part of a building, it could be part of a kind of glass enclosed structure, something that, or actually just a walkway with a covering, truthfully. We just want some type of climate controlled facility to be connecting the rail and the bus. There's also other options, as I said, to connect if you wanted to go below grade and make a connection there, but I understand your concerns with, right, having something that's not secure would be
And to the issues that you raised, it's a walk uphill from that bus station. So in January, you want a place that you can have climate control. But Garden should still be a great street, so in the summertime you can walk up and down the hill.
Yeah, we want to keep the, we want to keep the street traffic
A little over
alive
200
too. It's
feet,
important
225
to,
feet.
have it an active street also. So, we haven't designed it yet. I'm not quite sure, but we've tossed around a few different ideas. So.
Thank you for your patience. It always takes me a while to get these. Can you explain to me a little bit more about which buses are going to be in the bus there? And is Spruce Street going to be widened? And where are the city buses going to be?
The only routes that are pulling into the facility would be the same routes that pull into Union Station today. So there's 5 local bus routes that end at Union Station, and those are the 5 that we're assuming would pull into the new facility. So the bus routes that continue on Asylum and on Farmington would still be routed the same way, and so you would make connections on the street.
If they go down, they do it on Spruce Street now, and they would again?
Correct. Yeah, any buses that don't currently pull into Union Station, and I have those numbers, I can share them with you afterwards on my other.
But so is Spruce Street going to be widened?
I'm not aware of Spruce Street being widened.
I'd have to look at Nick. I mean, we did consider whether there might be a need for a turn lane to serve Garden Street, but I don't know if that's fully resolved.
Just remember, this is not lane lines on these diagrams here. There's more engineering that goes into the intersection design. This is really just a conceptual view of the overall area. So that we have other drawings that we think that would have more detail for some of the lanes.
Okay, because, I was just on, there are sometimes a lot of buses at the same time in the same place. Last week from between Union and as far up the hill I could see there were 17 buses.
A lot of those are probably intercity buses.
There's Intercity, Peter Pan, Fast Track, and then the week before that I was on Spruce Street making the turn on Church Street with 6 buses. So, they take up a lot of room and they really don't make it easy.
Well, the intercity buses would definitely be pulling into the facility, and then the 5 local buses would be pulling into the facility. So they wouldn't be staged on Spruce Street as you see them.
Well, they're on Union now.
Right, so they would be pulling into the facility instead. So they would be pulling in off the street into the facility.
Would that be the end of the route, or they would still go downtown?
If they end at Union Station now and turn around, then they would. If not, they would continue their normal routing.
But they would pull in the station to keep going?
Only the 5 that currently do now.
Is that the ones on Union Place?
Correct. Yeah,
So
I can give you
those
the numbers.
buses, they go to downtown, then they terminate at Union Station. So the perfect buses to come into this bus facility, because they're already taking their layover at Union Station.
Right. Those are the only ones that we're talking about that would pull in.
When they start their return trip, they hit the downtown, and then they go out.
All together.
Well, whatever their schedule is.
Yeah, however. And, the transit operations will be relooked at, once this facility is being designed.
On the bus parking, on the ground level, can you make it retail space so it won't be a concrete barrier?
I would think there'd be opportunities to try and activate these frontages. Bill, I'd maybe let you.
Well, we purposely have pushed the bus facility back from Asylum to reflect TOD development, so.
I just remember my other question, and that connection between the rail and the bus. That's not going to, if it's going to be an uphill grade, is that okay for like wheelchair or handicap access?
It would be relatively flat. It's about 3%.
Oh, all right.
Garden
It's not
Street
as
doesn't
steep.
really start to descend more steeply until after it crosses over the highway. So this part isn't actually as steep.
Okay, all right.
And there are examples of how to create active frontages, office spaces, retail at the ground floor of garage structures. So I would think that that's possible. I think it has to be worked through with the team going forward to make sure when the location is set that we have that as a performance criteria.
So we've got some last question.
What's going to be on Garden Street to make it pedestrian friendly?
We have not identified the full range of bicyclist pedestrian accommodations. I would imagine it would include widened sidewalks, potentially bike lanes. I would assume we'd have some street furniture, whether that's street trees, types of amenities like
Right.
that.
The hope is that the development sites that do front on it would have active frontage on it as well. So that this would be, we don't want it to be a back street, we want it to be a city street. So the goal is to create that as complete of a street as we can make for that access point to come down Asylum Hill down to the new repurposed Union Station. It's a very important front door for Union Station from this side, the way it's considered now. Yes, exactly.
So, I think what I heard was, a couple folks mentioned E1. Maybe what we can propose to do is advance these two northern concepts. And I think one thing we'd like to do is get back to you on what exactly that cost difference is. We're still in the process of finalizing those cost estimates, but ultimately, we do think that could end up being a big number and kind of shapes part of our thinking with recommending E3. But I think, I didn't really hear any opposition to moving forward with a northern concept.
I just had one last one here. I just stole the microphone. I wanted to second the concept E1 and getting that bus and parking over the cap. Just see that as good use of the cap and a better use of developable land that we could keep free. So.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so we'll pull forward both of those two concepts and get back to you on some of the cost differences. Sorry, so thanks to the, we have.
Is the cap next to the rail in E3 included? As I heard you say it would be a great spot for a cap next to the rail there with the green rectangle in it.
Right.
Is that part of E3 or it's a possibility?
I would say it's a possibility being strongly recommended by the city, as we are conducting cost estimates for the two different scenarios, and I think it is going to have to be part of the conversation moving forward. And I think as we get into a greater level of detail in designing these station concepts, I think we'll start to be able to answer some of those questions a little bit more clearly.
And that would allow someone to walk from the rail there down free to where Spruce Street is? Is that whole area capped, including the white part?
The white.
I think
to
that
your
reflects
right.
the TOD.
Yeah. This is intended to reflect a potential building.
Okay. All right. So.
But there would be sidewalks along Asylum.
Yeah, we'd certainly envisioning like widened sidewalks along Asylum.
And then the other question is, so where would the bus traffic, the intercity bus traffic, get when they're coming off the highway? How would they access the bus station?
Well, actually, we have circulation maps that, Casey, did you end up, I have the small
I don't have
copies
them
here.
in the presentation. I can try and
share
diagram
them
or maybe.
with you. But we have the diagrams, I have the diagrams with me, as well as the bus routes that would be serving the station. So I'm happy to talk about that with you after the presentation. Okay. And you also.
It's okay. So in the interest of time and getting to our other content, I think thank you, panel.
Okay.
Thank you for your good questions, everyone. So I know we've talked about local roads a lot over the last few PAC meetings. I'm really just going to give an update on kind of where we've come since November and where we're heading. So this is kind of a big picture drawing of the lowered highway alternative. You can see it covers basically all of Hartford, the Connecticut River, Bulkley Bridge. Lowered highway runs through here. We are illustrating that relocated railroad here to the north. So in terms of some of the things within the lowered highway alternative that we're still working on, we've touched on a few times. We have our reasonable range of alternatives. That's our 3 eastern interchange options, E3, E5, and E6 that we're planning on analyzing through the DEIS process. We've also been doing a lot of coordination with stakeholders and the city regarding the local road network in Asylum Hill. We've developed a couple different ways to try and help mitigate traffic and travel speeds for folks coming off the ramp. We've also been coordinating closely with the Hartford. They have a proposal to convert Garden Street between Collins and Myrtle into a public multi-use pathway that would serve bicyclists and pedestrians. That's something we're continuing to work with the city. We'll continue to update this group as those thoughts and ideas evolve. We've also been looking at some different ways to align that Hawthorne Street extension here down in the western part of the project area. There's a potential development site out there, and we've been working with some of the stakeholders that work with Anna to come up with the best way to align that city street. But ultimately, a lot of our attention in both this group and elsewhere has been looking at the Trident. So just to recap for everyone, this is an existing angled photo. You can see Broad Street right through the middle. There's Farmington. Here's Asylum. When we talk about the Trident, we're really referring to the series of 3 intersections: Farmington and Broad, Asylum and Cogswell, and then Farmington and Asylum. So as you all know, today it does not operate well, and with the potential changes in travel patterns. So today, one of the big drivers for travel patterns in the Trident is access, particularly in the PM, to this eastbound on-ramp that comes from Broad Street. Ultimately, in the lowered highway alternative, that would be moved. That would be moved to that new road, kind of off the page here, that Road A, that Bushnell Park West. So that does make the general travel patterns for people traversing the Trident change. So we'd also like to ensure that not only does it operate well for vehicles, that it needs to be a better bicyclist pedestrian corridor. And David Spillane, going back to the hub study, has always talked about the importance of bridging from Asylum Hill down to downtown with a strong pedestrian connection. So we've looked at a ton of concepts, literally. We talked a lot about that crazy octopus-like roundabout at the last meeting, and at that last November PAC meeting, we went through these 4 concepts, including that roundabout. I think we all concluded at the time that roundabout was just not going to work. The complexity, the number of lanes, poor pedestrian environment. So we have taken that one off the table. We also had that western shift alternative that would have moved the intersection of Farmington and Asylum about a block to the west. Ultimately, that would have impacted the DAS parking garage. As we're weighing these alternatives under NEPA, an extra building impact for one alternative, ultimately couldn't be justified. And so we've removed the western shift, and that leaves us with our Farmington extension and the discontinuous Broad Street of the 4 concepts we presented last time. Just to touch on the discontinuous Broad, this is the idea to cut off Broad Street for vehicles between Farmington and Asylum. There would still be a bicyclist pedestrian connection through there. And that would allow these 3 intersections to operate far more effectively and potentially allow us to have fewer travel lanes and help create a better bicyclist pedestrian environment. However, we do understand, and the feedback we've gotten has been very strong about the desire to keep Broad Street as a through movement. And so with that in mind, we have kept this Farmington Avenue extension, which again has been championed by the city and their consultant team. And as this is a city street, we've been happy now to adopt this. You saw it illustrated on those multimodal station graphics. It does keep Broad Street open. We are continuing to analyze the potential traffic operations. As a result of keeping that Broad Street open, these intersections still are fairly complex from a signalization perspective, requiring quite a few travel lanes. So we are a little concerned about the bicyclist pedestrian character of these roadways, particularly with a proposed multimodal station located right off Asylum. In addition, we've been looking at Farmington Avenue and whether we can provide the type of bicyclist accommodations we'd like to, given the width of the street and some of these potential impacts. But either way, we are continuing to look at these 2 options as we move forward, and we could potentially evaluate both options in the DEIS. So again, just to wrap that part up, we've adopted that Farmington extension, continuing to analyze both of these 2 concepts, and we do envision a potential level 3 screening document that could filter out these Trident concepts prior to the DEIS. Jackie.
At night, when the Civic Center, what the Excel Center lets out when all the clubs close, can you back up one? There's a lot of traffic that goes up Asylum Hill. I'm assuming they're going Farmington, Asylum Avenue. So with the new Farmington Avenue extension, a lot of that traffic would take a left on the Bushnell Park West to get to Asylum Avenue. Is that
You know, I tend to think they'd come a little bit further up the hill. From a travel distance perspective, it'd be a little shorter. To either late at night, you would probably use Broad Street, not a lot of traffic. It would be relatively easy to make a left, and then even if you had to, you're right on red. During the peak conditions, it might be more likely to see people come up to Asylum Place. That would be a little bit shorter as well. But yeah, I mean, that would also be an option to come down Bushnell Park West, although it would be the kind of longest of those three scenarios. But you bring up a good question. One of the things we're continuing to evaluate with this Farmington extension is how it fits travel patterns, and that's something that we haven't really come to a full conclusion on, but certainly something we're still working on. Tony?
Wants to go on Asylum Street and will be coming back out of Asylum Street. With this Farmington Avenue extension, you're actually reinforcing another route to downtown, which is also used a lot, which is Capitol Avenue. And particularly when the Bushnell lets out, it's on Capitol Avenue. I don't see why you wouldn't go right up Capitol Avenue to do the Farmington Avenue extension, if you wanted to go out Farmington Avenue, or you could go over to Asylum. But I think it's a mistake to assume that all the exiting downtown traffic is coming out of Asylum.
Sure, no, that's a fair question, and we do recognize the potential new travel route this offers, and yeah, we're certainly continuing to weigh that. I mean, I think we are continuing to evaluate those travel patterns. I don't think we've really locked anything in there yet. Tony?
Just in general, I like seeing new connections because it does give options during both peak travel times and other times. So I see it, any of the proposals for the Trident seem to be giving more options than less for how folks can get from one place to another in that area.
Thanks for your comment. No, that's true. Okay, I will move along to CT Fast Track. So you may be asking, why are we talking about CT Fast Track? So for the same reason that we talk about relocating the railroad, because CT Fast Track follows that same corridor crossing beneath the highway today, you're looking at kind of a view looking east. Here's the Capitol, Bushnell Park. This yellow line actually denotes the railroad corridor, but CT Fast Track again parallels that all the way to Asylum, essentially. So I'm going to go to a plan view map of existing conditions. So again, today CT Fast Track, the guideway comes in from the Parkville station, has its Sigourney Street station, crosses at that skew underneath I-84, and really the guideway terminates at Asylum. So early on in the process, we'd presented a concept for reconfiguring CT Fast Track in conjunction with the lowered highway. And basically, unlike the railroad, which we've eliminated the crossing, we would still like to see CT Fast Track cross the highway and rail corridors to start to get folks toward the CBD. So this concept we presented a while ago. I'm going to zoom in here on this area in the vicinity of Sigourney Street to illustrate how we envision that crossing. So here's Sigourney Street. The gray here is the lower highway alternative, the proposed highway, and here's Broad Street. So what would happen here is the guideway would come in, here's the Sigourney Street station, would start to descend and be in this tunnel section beneath the railroad, beneath the highway, and then come up around underneath Broad Street, but start to come up the grade, and then terminate at that Bushnell Park West Road where it would traverse left up towards Asylum. So this was essentially our favorite concept early on in the process. About a year and a half ago, we conducted a cost estimate. And we estimated about $390 million prior to escalation, prior to contingency. In addition to that, we thought it would take about 4.5 years to construct. Very complex construction. We'd be building this basically underneath the existing viaduct, trying to keep it in place. And so CT Fast Track would be out of service for that extended period of time. So we have been back to the drawing board. And so that's why we haven't really presented something to you till today where we feel like we've answered a lot of the questions on that. So again, we developed many different ideas. We've now looked at 9 complete alternatives with many sub-alternatives to that. And ultimately, as we've evaluated those, we've considered their ability to let CT Fast Track access the central business district. You know, there's these two CT Fast Track routes whose primary purpose is to get to downtown. There are other circulator routes that I'll talk about that use some other local streets. And then we'd like to, you know, allow those folks at CT Fast Track to meet their service goals, both in the permanent condition as well as temporarily during the highway construction. And then as with everything we look at, we also are considering building property impacts as well as costs. So our latest thinking is, instead of having that crossing underneath the highway and railroad near Etna, near Sigourney Street and Broad Streets, we're looking a little bit further to the west near Laurel Street. So I'm going to zoom in on this area where we envision this crossing. So here's Capitol Avenue, now raised above I-84 and above the railroad. Here's that new Hawthorne extension that I talked about. We're still working on the specific alignment here. Here's Laurel Street, which would go over both the railroad and the highway. And here's Sigourney Street. So again, the guideway would come off the Parkville station, start to descend as it passed beneath Capitol Avenue, and we'd have this crossing beneath the highway. It would go under the railroad, under the lowered highway, and kind of most importantly, under the existing highway. So they'd be able to build this while maintaining traffic on the existing highway. So this could be a very early on part of the I-84 program construction, and be done in a manner to keep CT Fast Track in service for as long as possible during the construction of the highway. So what does that mean? Obviously, it brings the primary guideway away from the existing Sigourney Street station. So we do envision that there could be a kind of satellite or Sigourney Street South station constructed basically at the corner of Capitol and Sigourney, and that could provide access vertically up to Sigourney as well as at grade to Capitol. But we do also understand that there's really high ridership that uses the Sigourney Street station for good reason, very large employer right immediately adjacent to it. So we did devise a way to keep that existing Sigourney Street station, and it's by having a spur come off the guideway beneath Laurel Street and access that existing station. So there's that spur highlighted. And again, we do kind of envision that these stations could function together, that there could be ways to, you know, through vertical access up to Sigourney Street, ensure that people can move between them if they so chose. And here's just another little view of that. The existing Sigourney Street station functioning under the prior concept where the guideway passes through it and continues off to the CBD, versus now this idea of having the primary guideway with a new Sigourney Street South as well as the existing station with its spur. So I'm going to continue to shift a little bit to the east and talk about how the guideway terminates. And first, I'm going to illustrate a couple of the different routes. So the primary routes when we think of CT Fast Track go straight to the CBD. They use the guideway the whole way. But there are other routes that today exit the Sigourney Street station. Under this revised concept, they could use that Sigourney Street South station. And they circulate to downtown via Capitol Avenue and then up Main Street. The other family of routes would use that guideway spur to the existing Sigourney Street station, go up Sigourney and use Farmington to enter downtown and head to the CBD. So those would still kind of function in those manners. And then I'm going to talk about a couple different ways we envision terminating the actual guideway and how the routes could function under those scenarios. So again, that's bringing the guideway a little bit further to the east for these routes that focus on the CBD. So we'll zoom in here a little bit on the existing layout just to orient everyone. So we've illustrated the busway here in yellow. So again, the guideway passes beneath I-84 today, beneath Broad Street, curves around here with the railroad, and then merges with those I-84 on and off ramps. So then today you have the routes that use Capitol, routes that use Farmington, as well as the main guideway routes that take all the way to Asylum, turn right in Asylum, and then they use either Ford Jewel or Pearl Streets to get over to Main Street, come up Main, cycle back on Asylum, and get on the guideway. So that's sort of your existing circulation pattern for those CT Fast Track routes that access the CBD and use the guideway the whole way. So one option we've developed would take the guideway and pass it under Broad Street and then hook up with our new Bushnell Park West. And again, we'd still have those Capitol Avenue routes, we'd still have the Farmington routes. Now again, with the Farmington extension, we're envisioning they would use Asylum Place and then continue down Asylum. Those could be well served to be the primary routes that stop right at that rail station. But as we think about the guideway itself, it would come through here. I just want to point out, we're continuing to evaluate the potential impacts to the current. We aren't actually pushing any infrastructure further, closer to it than we've illustrated previously, but there is still some concern, potential impacts to parking spaces that we're going to continue to evaluate as a team moving forward. So it would pass the current underneath Broad Street and then intersect and terminate at Farmington Extension and that Road A, that Bushnell Park West. Now, under this scenario, we would not be able to provide that Road B we've talked about as a local street. This would be dedicated to the busway. So the routes would come to that intersection where they would no longer be on the dedicated guideway, follow up that Bushnell Park West, and turn right at Asylum and circulate the central business district as they do today. So that's one option. Option 2 would bring the guideway up to intersect with Broad Street. So we'd still have the Capitol routes, still have the Farmington routes that would likely be the primary access to the rail station. But then we'd have our guideway would terminate at an accurate intersection with Broad Street. So the guideway would come to there, and then it would use that Road B. Now we can use that Road B as a new local street. So the buses would use that and then turn left and come up that Bushnell Park West, and again, circuit the CBD as they do today. And then final option would bring the guideway all the way to Church Street, and it would reuse or adaptively reuse a lot of that existing railroad infrastructure. So we would take the guideway, so we'd still have those Capitol routes, we still have the Farmington routes, but these new Church Street routes may also be able to serve the rail station. So the guideway would follow the previous alignments under Broad Street. Now it would climb, cross above the Farmington extension, and line up with the railroad embankment, right? That's with the 2 retaining walls on each side that carries the railroad. So it would follow that, cross above Asylum Street, and use either a rehabilitated or reconstructed viaduct through Union Station, cross over Church Street, and then hook around to line up to Church Street. Now, some potential ideas for that. There could be a Union Station stop that would allow Union Station to still have a transportation use, and that could be, depending on how that be connected to either the bus facility, the rail facility, could be another way for some of these routes to access the rail station. But ultimately, that would be a new circulation pattern downtown, and we're cognizant of the fact that could raise some issues with folks along the existing routes where buses stop today. And so in addition to some of those changes, we're also considering the potential cost implications of needing to rehabilitate that rail viaduct. There are some estimates out there that kind of range from 50 to 100 million in terms of cost. And right now that's a facility owned and maintained by Amtrak. So it's something the DOT would have to take that on. So it's certainly something we're cognizant of and continuing to evaluate here as we move forward. So, essentially we feel like we've hit on this idea of a new crossing location near Laurel Street. It's less expensive than the prior concept, would allow the busway to remain in operation during the majority of construction. And we're going to continue to analyze and look at how those Sigourney Street stations would function, as well as how we terminate the guideway. And ultimately, we're looking to document a preferred alignment, which could be in that level 3 screening process that we've talked about. So you don't have to listen to me anymore. I'm going to have Christine come up. I've been just doing forward that.
Okay.
Do you need a point?
I will.
This? If you just use them.
No, I don't think I need to point. But wait. It's not doing anything. Okay. I know we've had a full meeting, so I'll be as brief as I can, but I just wanted to give you an update on where we are with the environmental impact statement. As most of you know, we are pretty well into developing the DEIS. The DEIS has a lot of different components and elements, but there are 4 technical reports that really drive the major issues within the DEIS. The first is a cultural resources technical report, which looks at architectural resources and archaeological resources. We've had a couple of versions of that document, and actually it's gone through consulting party review, and we just recently, about a week ago, resubmitted a revised version of that technical report. The air quality technical report was submitted in January of 2018. Noise and vibration will be submitted in about a week for DOT's review. And then the land use and socioeconomic technical report will be developed and generated at the beginning of April for DOT's initial review. So for the first two technical reports that are already out there, I'm just going to summarize the findings. And then for the second two, I'll give you an idea of what to expect. So for cultural resources, again, we looked at above ground and below ground resources. We've identified 52 known resources that were already listed or already eligible, and they're depicted on this map. There were also a lot of resources that had never been surveyed before, so we surveyed them, and we made recommendations of eligibility for 16 of those additional resources that are on this map and listed. And then we had to look at how the reasonable range of alternatives was going to impact those resources. I know this looks like a busy table, but the left column is the actual resource that's going to be impacted either indirectly or directly. The middle column is all the resources that are going to be directly impacted and by what alternatives are going to be directly impacted by. And then the indirect impacts are in the right column. And I think the biggest takeaway from this is if you look at the reasonable range of alternatives, there's very little differentiation between the number of historic resources impacted by the individual alternatives. They're all pretty much the same. They have the same impacts to historic resources, except for E6S, which has an additional 2 impacts to 2 historic resources, the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Building and 6973 Myrtle Street. So bottom line on the historic resource impacts, there's not a lot of differentiation between the alternatives except for E6S. And we're going through the 106 process and developing a 4F evaluation to go through and identify mitigation and how we're going to address these impacts. Below ground, we did a phase 1 archaeological investigation as part of the Cultural Resources Technical Report, and that guided us to 54 other areas that we need to do further subsurface archaeological investigation on. We've agreed to those properties with OEP and SHPO, and we're currently acquiring the necessary permits and rights of entries to go and do that archaeological testing. There's going to be a variety of testing, including geoprobes. We're going to do some excavation trenches, shovel test pits in grassed areas where we can easily access, and excavation units. So we're anticipating a spring start for that archaeological investigation and completing up in the summer of this year. This is just an illustration showing through the corridor where we're going to be doing the various types of archaeological investigation. And these findings, the results that come out of this investigation will all be included in the draft environmental impact statement. In terms of the air quality technical report, that was done in January. Some of you have probably had a chance to look at that. We did a carbon monoxide microscale analysis, which looked at 8 worst-case intersections in the study area to determine whether or not emissions exceeded national air quality standards, and there were no exceedances of national air quality standards for future build conditions. We also did a mobile source air toxics analysis, which looks at 9 different air toxics and how the emissions will affect those 9 toxics. And what we found is if you look at 2040 build conditions compared to existing conditions, there's a 70 to 99% reduction in emissions based on, depending on whatever pollutant we're talking about. Similarly, if you compare 2040 build conditions to 2040 no build conditions, there's a 9 to 18% reduction in emissions. And the reason we're seeing this reduction in emissions is because you've got improved level of service, we've got reduced congestion, reduced vehicle miles traveled, and cleaner burning vehicles. In terms of temporary impacts, there are going to be temporary air quality impacts during construction, and you'll see a qualitative discussion of that in the technical report. The noise and vibration technical report looked at the noise generated from the highway using FHWA's traffic noise model. We also looked at noise and vibration from the rail component based on FTA's noise and vibration guidelines. We looked at 17 baseline noise measurement areas, which you can see here outlined in yellow on this map. We actually did monitoring in those locations so that we could validate the future prediction models. And we evaluated existing conditions, 2040 build and 2040 no build conditions. And what we found basically with the lowered alternative is that lowering the highway, and especially in those areas where it's depressed or slightly depressed, the cut acts as a shield, a noise shield to the sensitive receptors nearby. The highway and the local streets is generating most of the noise out there, and basically we evaluated that, again, based on the traffic noise model. We identified locations where we analyzed noise barriers and the effect of noise barriers. We had to look at Connecticut DOT's feasible and reasonable criteria to determine whether or not they were warranted, and we came up with a recommendation that out of those 10, one noise barrier was deemed reasonable and feasible. In terms of vibration, particularly due to the slow speed of the trains running through the area, there are really no vibration-related impacts. The vibration from diesel locomotives is not predicted to exceed the FTA annoyance level, and similarly, it doesn't exceed the threshold for structural damage. Land use and socioeconomic technical report. Again, this hasn't been seen by anybody yet. We're going to be submitting that to DOT early April for their review. But this basically looks at the affected environment, the impacts and the mitigation to the community resources, demographics, environmental justice populations. And I think one of the takeaways and one of the points of interest in that document, it is going to identify the residential and the commercial displacements generated by the project, and it's going to include a relocation plan that's going to identify potential areas for relocation housing and how we're going to handle that, because there are quite a few residential impacts that people are going to be displaced. So that's a document where you're going to see the preliminary findings of how that's going to work out. In terms of the overall DEIS schedule, about early 2019 is when you folks will be seeing the draft environmental impact statement. Around this time next year, we'll be having a public hearing on the DEIS, and then we'll be gearing up for our final EIS and our record of decision in the summer of 2020. So I know that was a lot of information in a little bit of time, but any questions? Yes?
The relocation that you're talking about, is that to existing housing or the creation of new housing?
That is identifying the existing housing that is going to be displaced and how we might relocate them and where we might relocate them.
But not necessarily in replacing, not a plan to replace the housing that's being taken down.
It is a plan to replace the housing that's being taken down, yes.
Building new housing.
We don't know yet. I mean, it'll be in the plan. DOT has taken the lead on that relocation plan, and it's looking at existing available housing in the area, but it also may look at other modes such as reconstruction, new housing. Yeah.
Because we have a concern about losing so many people out of our neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Understood.
It's gone, and it's market. A lot of it's not, it's not restrictive housing. So we need all that we can get in the neighborhood.
Right. Understood. Any other questions, comments? Okay.
So, can you put into like more detail what your expectation is as to the vibration of the diesel locomotives? Like you have that they're below the threshold of structural damage, but what does that mean? I mean, are there more numbers to that? Or?
There are numbers to that, and that will be in the noise and vibration technical report. I don't have those in my head, but I can certainly provide you with them. But yeah, there are certain thresholds, and it doesn't exceed those thresholds, so there's no impact.
And is there any way to compare it to what there is now?
I think I'll have to look into that in a little more detail. I mean, what the vibration technical report does is look at the 2040 build conditions and how that's going to, and it compares it. It does compare it to existing, but I can get you that information and give you a little more detail on that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so I'll just wrap up quick here. We are targeting a series of public forums. Primary topics likely would be on the multimodal station, a lot of the content we talked about today, and potentially the I-84, I-91 interchange study. We're going to start to advance conceptual design of those rail station concepts. And then we're going to develop this level 3 screening document that'll look to identify CT fast track alignments as well as those local road trident concepts that would be vetted in the DEIS. So with that, thanks for your time. Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Dr. Bob, is he still here? You asked that we reschedule the local roads session working group that was derailed because we had a position from
Sure.
Congressman Larson, and I think we still need to do that.
Sure. Sure, we can organize something on that front.
We could tear this meeting so far apart if we could meet on a smaller.
Sure.
smaller
No,
group.
absolutely. Yeah, no, we'd be happy to put something like that together. Sure.
That would be great.
Workshop like you did with the station.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure.
My name is J. Stan McCauley, and I do business as Lightsource Productions. I provide professional services in the area of strategic video communications. First, what we do is we help you craft your message using what I call the rule of the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. We do event documentation, content acquisition, full-scale productions, editing, and of course distribution through our social media television network. And with social media, video is more important now than it has ever been. Whether you're talking big business, small business, nonprofit, church, or just an individual. Let's say you plan you're planning an event, a wedding, whatever the case may be, but let's say a big event, but no video. And you spent all this time, all these hours to put this event on, and maybe 100, 200 people attend the event. But more important than that is that thousands could attend by watching it on social media. But of course, you don't think about this until after the event is over. You can't afford not to capture it for social media. And despite what people think, I am affordable. Give me a call. Let's plan your next video project and share it with the world on my social media television network. I promise you that you will have the attention of one person, me.